You are standing in the scorching heat of the Sahara Desert in the year 1324, watching the horizon shimmer like liquid gold. The sand dunes stretch endlessly in every direction, broken only by the occasional acacia tree struggling against the relentless sun. Then you see it, a dark line moving across the vastness, growing larger with each passing hour. As it approaches, you realize this isn't a mirage or a caravan of ordinary merchants. This is something that defies comprehension. 60,000 people stretch across the desert floor in a procession that seems to have no beginning and no end. Camels loaded with provisions lumber forward in perfect formation. Horses with golden bridles prance beneath riders dressed in silk that catches the desert wind. At the front of this impossible parade walks a column of 500 servants, each carrying a staff of pure gold that gleams like captured sunlight. And at the center of it all, mounted on a magnificent black stallion, rides a man whose wealth was so vast that economists today still struggle to calculate its true value. His name was Mansa Musa, and you are witnessing the most extravagant display of wealth in human history. But here's what will shock you. This legendary pilgrimage was just the tip of the iceberg. The real story of Mansa Musa isn't just about gold or riches. It's about how one man built a silent empire so powerful that its influence reached from the Atlantic Ocean to the Arabian Peninsula, yet remained hidden from European eyes for centuries. Before we dive into this forgotten tale of power and prosperity, if you find yourself captivated by these hidden stories of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content that uncovers the truths time tried to bury. And please, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always amazed by how we can explore these ancient mysteries together from every corner of the world, connected by our shared fascination with the past. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about medieval Africa, about wealth, and about the delicate balance between power and secrecy that allowed one empire to flourish while remaining invisible to half the world. The story begins not with Musa's legendary wealth, but with blood and betrayal in the heart of West Africa. Picture the year 1312, a time when Europe was emerging from its darkest centuries, when the Mongol Empire was fragmenting across Asia, and when most of the known world had never heard of a place called Mali. In this remote corner of West Africa, a drama was unfolding that would reshape the continent's destiny. Mansa Musa, ruler of the Mali Empire, stood on the banks of the Niger River, his eyes fixed on the western horizon. He had commissioned 400 ships to explore the vast Atlantic Ocean, convinced that somewhere beyond the endless waters lay lands of unimaginable wealth. When only one ship returned, its captain spoke of currents so powerful they resembled mighty rivers, of depths that swallowed entire fleets. Most rulers would have taken this as a warning. Muhammad saw it as a challenge. Against all advice, the Mansa ordered 2,000 more vessels to be prepared. 1,000 would carry him and his chosen warriors. Another 1,000 would transport supplies for what he believed would be a journey to glory. Before departing on this doomed expedition, Muhammad made a decision that would change the course of African history. He named his young relative, Musa, as caretaker emperor, a temporary position that was never meant to become permanent. As Muhammad's fleet disappeared into the Atlantic's embrace, never to return, Musa found himself thrust into power over an empire that spanned territories larger than Western Europe. He was in his early 30s, intelligent and diplomatic, but inheriting a realm that was both incredibly wealthy and dangerously fragmented. The Mali Empire wasn't a single nation as Europeans understood it. It was a complex web of kingdoms, city-states, and tribal territories held together by trade agreements, military might, and the delicate art of political persuasion. What made this inheritance so extraordinary wasn't just its size, but its location. Mali sat at the crossroads of the ancient world, controlling trade routes that connected the Mediterranean civilizations to the riches of sub-Saharan Africa. Gold flowed north from mines whose locations were so closely guarded that foreign merchants never saw them. Salt, more valuable than silver in many regions, moved south from the Sahara's hidden deposits. Ivory, copper, and slaves formed the backbone of commerce that enriched every settlement along these routes. But Musa inherited more than trade networks and territorial boundaries. He inherited a system of governance that was centuries ahead of its time in many respects, yet built on foundations that modern minds would find both fascinating and troubling. The empire operated on principles of federalism that wouldn't appear in Europe for hundreds of years. Local rulers maintained authority over their regions while pledging loyalty to the Mansa, paying tribute in goods and soldiers rather than being directly governed from the capital. The wealth that flowed into Musa's treasury came from a carefully orchestrated economic system that modern economists might recognize as sophisticated mercantilism. Every gold nugget found within the empire's borders belonged by law to the Mansa, while miners kept the gold dust as payment for their labor. This seemingly simple arrangement created a monopoly that ensured steady revenue while maintaining incentives for continued mining operations. Trade towns flourished at strategic points where different transportation methods met, where camels gave way to donkeys, where riverboats transferred goods to overland caravans. These weren't just commercial centers, but melting pots where Arabic mixed with local languages, where Islamic scholars debated with traditional griots, where architectural styles blended to create something entirely new. Yet despite this wealth and sophistication, Mali remained largely invisible to the outside world. European maps of the period showed vast blank spaces where this empire actually stood. The Sahara Desert served as both a natural barrier and an intentional screen, protecting the sources of wealth while allowing trade to flow through carefully controlled channels. Arab merchants from North Africa knew of Mali's existence and wealth, but they were bound by commercial agreements and practical necessity to keep the empire's secrets. This invisibility was no accident. Musa and his predecessors had learned that knowledge of their wealth could be as dangerous as the wealth itself. Foreign powers who discovered rich territories tended to want to conquer them. By maintaining their empire's low profile while maximizing its economic output, the Malian rulers had created something unprecedented, a superpower that operated in the shadows. The capital city of Niani, where Musa held court, reflected this balance between magnificence and discretion. Foreign visitors were rare, but those who did reach the city described a place of stunning beauty and sophisticated culture. The royal palace complex included multiple buildings constructed from the finest materials available, decorated with intricate artwork that blended Islamic and traditional African motifs. Elephant tusks flanked the throne where Musa conducted the business of empire, while the surrounding courtyards could accommodate thousands of visitors during major festivals and ceremonies. But perhaps most impressive was the empire's military capability. Musa commanded an army estimated at 100,000 soldiers, including 10,000 cavalry units equipped with horses imported from Arabia and North Africa. These weren't primitive tribal warriors, but professionally trained soldiers equipped with advanced metallurgy, organized into specialized units, and capable of projecting power across vast distances. The empire's blacksmiths had developed techniques for working iron and copper that produced weapons and tools superior to those found in many parts of Europe. This military might serve multiple purposes beyond simple conquest. It protected the trade routes that were the empire's lifeblood, deterred neighboring kingdoms from challenging Malian authority, and provided the security necessary for merchants to transport valuable goods across thousands of miles of potentially dangerous territory. More subtly, it served as a diplomatic tool, the implicit threat that allowed Musa to negotiate from positions of strength while rarely needing to actually deploy his forces. The religious dimension of Musa's empire adds another layer to this complex story. Islam had been gradually spreading across West Africa for centuries, but it coexisted with traditional beliefs in ways that European Christianity rarely tolerated with its own competing faiths. Musa himself was a devout Muslim, but he ruled over subjects who practiced various forms of traditional religion, Christianity, and numerous syncretic belief systems that blended elements from multiple sources. This religious tolerance wasn't just philosophical, it was practical. An empire spanning such diverse territories and populations could only maintain stability by accommodating different beliefs and customs. Musa's genius lay in understanding that forced conversion would create rebellion, while voluntary adoption of Islam often followed naturally from increased trade and cultural contact with Muslim merchants and scholars. The educational systems that Musa inherited and expanded reflect this sophisticated approach to governance. Students from across the empire traveled to centers of learning, where they studied not just Islamic theology and law, but mathematics, astronomy, literature, and practical skills like administration and diplomacy. Some of the brightest were sent to Morocco and other centers of Islamic learning, creating networks of educated administrators who could return to serve the empire while maintaining connections to the broader Muslim world. As Musa consolidated his power during the first decade of his reign, he faced challenges that would have destroyed lesser rulers. The empire's very success created problems. Prosperity attracted the attention of hostile neighbors, while the complex federal system required constant negotiation and occasional displays of force to maintain loyalty. Regional governors needed to be kept satisfied without being allowed to become too independent. Trade routes required protection from bandits while remaining profitable for merchants. Military forces needed to be maintained and equipped without bankrupting the treasury. Perhaps most challenging of all, Musa had to navigate the delicate balance between visibility and invisibility that kept his empire safe. Too much secrecy would limit trade opportunities and diplomatic possibilities. Too much exposure would invite conquest attempts from powers that might view Mali's wealth as an irresistible target. This balance would soon be tested in ways that would echo through history, as events were already in motion that would force Musa to make a choice that would reveal his empire to the world. The year 1324 was approaching, and with it, a decision that would transform Musa from a successful but unknown African ruler into a figure of legend whose story would be told for centuries to come. The decision that would shatter Mali's centuries of careful invisibility came not from ambition, but from faith. As 1324 dawned, Musa faced a spiritual calling that would force him to choose between the safety of shadows and the dangerous light of international attention. The Hajj, the sacred pilgrimage to Mecca that every able-bodied Muslim was required to complete, beckoned to him with an intensity that grew stronger each passing year. Picture yourself in Musa's position, weighing this impossible choice in the privacy of your palace chambers. For over a decade, you had successfully maintained the delicate balance that kept your empire prosperous yet hidden. Your predecessors had built their power on discretion, on being the source of wealth that others sought but could never quite locate. Now, religious duty demanded that you abandon this strategy entirely and venture into the wider world, carrying with you evidence of the very riches you had worked so hard to conceal. The preparations alone would take months and reveal the true scale of Mali's resources to anyone paying attention. 60,000 people couldn't simply disappear from an empire without consequences. The logistics of feeding, transporting, and protecting such a massive expedition across 4,000 miles of desert and foreign territory would require revealing supply networks, military capabilities, and diplomatic connections that had remained secret for generations. But Musa had already made his choice. The spiritual pull of Mecca, combined with his genuine devotion to Islam, outweighed the political risks. What he perhaps didn't fully grasp was how this single decision would transform not just his own legacy, but the way the entire world understood Africa's place in medieval civilization. The caravan that assembled outside Niani in early 1324 was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Imagine the months of preparation required to organize such an expedition. Weapons had to be forged for 8,000 soldiers who would provide security across hostile territories. Provisions sufficient to feed 60,000 people for over a year had to be gathered, processed, and packed for transport. Hundreds of camels and horses needed to be acquired, trained, and equipped for the journey ahead. Most spectacular of all was the gold. 80 camels carried nothing but gold bars, each animal bearing 80 pounds of pure metal that gleamed like captured sunlight. 500 servants walked in formation, each carrying a staff of solid gold weighing 4 pounds. This wasn't just wealth, it was a statement, a declaration that Mali possessed resources beyond the imagination of most medieval rulers. But the true genius of Musa's pilgrimage lay in its dual nature. On the surface, it appeared to be an act of pure religious devotion, a wealthy king fulfilling his spiritual obligations regardless of cost. Beneath this pious exterior, however, was a calculated diplomatic mission designed to establish Mali's presence on the international stage, while demonstrating the empire's power to potential allies and enemies alike. As the massive caravan began its journey across the grasslands of West Africa, word of its passing spread like wildfire through trading networks that stretched from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Merchants who had dealt with Malian gold for decades suddenly understood the true source of the wealth they had been trading. Nomadic tribes who controlled desert routes realized they were witnessing the emergence of a power that could reshape the balance of North African politics. The crossing of the Sahara itself became an epic of endurance and organization that demonstrated Mali's sophisticated understanding of logistics and leadership. Desert travel was notoriously dangerous. Temperatures that could kill during the day and freeze at night, sandstorms that could bury entire caravans, water sources separated by hundreds of miles of barren wasteland. Yet Musa's expedition moved across this hostile environment with the precision of a military campaign and the confidence of people who understood exactly what they were doing. The secret lay in preparation and local knowledge. Mali's traders had been crossing these routes for centuries, building relationships with desert nomads, establishing supply caches, and mapping every reliable water source across thousands of square miles of seemingly empty sand. What appeared to outside observers as an impossibly ambitious journey was actually the deployment of a transportation network that had been generations in the making. When the caravan finally reached the outskirts of Cairo in July 1324, the city's residents witnessed something that shattered their understanding of African wealth and power. Cairo was one of the great metropolises of the medieval world, home to nearly 1 million people, and the capital of the powerful Mamluk Sultanate. Its residents had seen impressive displays of wealth from across the known world. Byzantine emperors, Mongol Khans, Crusader kings. Nothing had prepared them for Mansa Musa. The economic impact of his visit became legendary. Musa distributed so much gold as gifts and payments that he single-handedly disrupted Cairo's economy for over a decade. The sudden influx of precious metal caused inflation that affected everything from bread prices to real estate values. Merchants who had operated successful businesses for years found their profit margins destroyed by the artificial abundance of gold flooding the market. But the economic disruption was nothing compared to the psychological impact. Here was proof that Africa contained kingdoms capable of matching or exceeding the wealth of any power in the Mediterranean world. The carefully maintained fiction that sub-Saharan Africa was a land of primitive tribes and modest resources collapsed in the face of Musa's overwhelming display of prosperity. The political implications rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. The Mamluk Sultan, initially prepared to treat Musa as an interesting but minor foreign dignitary, quickly realized he was dealing with a peer whose empire might well surpass his own in wealth and territorial extent. Diplomatic protocols had to be hastily revised, gifts and honors upgraded, and new channels of communication established with this previously unknown African superpower. European merchants and diplomats present in Cairo during Musa's visit carried news of the Golden Emperor back to courts from London to Constantinople. For the first time, European maps began to include references to Mali, though the cartographers struggled to accurately place or define this mysterious African empire. The famous Catalan Atlas of 1375, considered one of the masterpieces of medieval cartography, would eventually depict Musa as a crowned figure holding a golden orb, with text describing him as the richest ruler in Africa. Yet even as Mali's existence became known to the wider world, the empire's core secrets remained protected. Foreign observers could see the evidence of vast wealth, but they still couldn't determine its sources. The location of gold mines remained unknown to outsiders. The internal structure of the empire, its military capabilities, and its administrative systems stayed hidden behind the natural barriers of desert and distance. Musa understood this dynamic perfectly and used it to his advantage throughout his journey. He revealed enough of Mali's power to establish credibility and command respect, while maintaining enough mystery to prevent potential enemies from developing effective strategies against his empire. It was a masterclass in international diplomacy from a ruler who had supposedly been isolated from global politics for his entire life. The religious ceremonies in Mecca itself added another dimension to Musa's growing legend. Islamic law required all pilgrims to abandon worldly distinctions during the Hajj, wearing simple white garments and participating as equals regardless of their earthly status. For 12 days, the emperor of one of the world's wealthiest empires walked among common believers, praying and fasting like any other Muslim fulfilling his spiritual obligations. This display of humility paradoxically enhanced Musa's reputation even further. Here was a ruler so secure in his power that he could temporarily abandon all its trappings without fear. His genuine devotion to Islamic principles impressed religious scholars and political leaders alike, establishing Mali not just as a source of wealth, but as a legitimate member of the broader Islamic community. The conversations Musa held with scholars and diplomats during his time in Mecca revealed the sophisticated intellectual culture that had developed within his empire. He discussed theology with learned clerics, debated philosophy with traveling scholars, and exchanged ideas about governance with representatives from across the Muslim world. These interactions demonstrated that Mali's wealth was matched by educational and cultural achievements that rivaled those of more famous Islamic centers of learning. But perhaps most significantly, Musa's pilgrimage established Mali as a player in the complex web of alliances and rivalries that shaped medieval international relations. His presence in Mecca wasn't just a personal spiritual journey. It was a diplomatic mission that opened new channels of communication with powers from Spain to Central Asia. Trade agreements were discussed, military alliances explored, and cultural exchanges initiated that would influence African development for centuries to come. As news of the Golden Emperor's journey spread across 3 continents, the foundations were being laid for a transformation that would extend far beyond Musa's own lifetime. Mali had emerged from the shadows, and there would be no going back to the comfortable anonymity that had protected the empire for so long. The question now was whether Musa could navigate the dangerous new world of international visibility while maintaining the internal stability that had made his empire great. The answer would come to define not just his own legacy, but the future of African civilization itself. The return journey from Mecca would prove even more transformative than the pilgrimage itself, as Musa made decisions that would reshape the very geography of power in medieval Africa. But first, he faced a crisis that threatened everything he had built. Reports reached him in the holy city that his son Magan, left as regent in Niani, was struggling to maintain control. The Songhai people to the east had sensed weakness and launched attacks against Mali's borders, testing whether the empire could survive its ruler's absence. Standing in the courtyards of Mecca, surrounded by the architectural wonders of Islam's holiest city, Musa confronted a dilemma that would have broken lesser rulers. He could rush back to Mali by the fastest route, abandoning the diplomatic opportunities his pilgrimage had created. Or he could trust in the systems he had built and use this crisis as an opportunity to demonstrate Mali's resilience in ways that would echo across the medieval world. Musa chose the path that revealed his true genius as a strategist. Rather than racing home in apparent panic, he methodically gathered intelligence about the situation in Mali, while simultaneously recruiting some of the finest minds in the Islamic world to return with him. Poets, architects, scholars, and administrators, men whose reputations extended from Spain to Central Asia, accepted his invitation to join what they saw as a new center of Islamic civilization emerging in West Africa. Among these recruits was Abu Ishaq as-Sahili, known throughout the Islamic world simply as the Moor. This man was more than just an architect. He was an artist whose buildings had graced the courts of sultans and caliphs, whose reputation for creating structures that seemed to capture divine beauty in earthly materials was legendary. His decision to follow Musa back to Mali sent shockwaves through the scholarly communities of North Africa and the Middle East. If as-Sahili was willing to abandon established centers of Islamic culture for this African empire, what did that say about Mali's true potential? The return journey became a mobile university, a traveling symposium where ideas flowed as freely as the gold that had amazed Cairo. Musa spent hours each day in conversation with his new advisors, absorbing concepts about urban planning, educational systems, and architectural techniques that would soon transform the physical landscape of his empire. These weren't just casual discussions. They were intensive planning sessions for what amounted to a complete reimagining of how an African empire could engage with the wider world. But Musa's masterstroke came when he deliberately altered his return route to pass through territories that had been causing trouble for Mali's eastern borders. Instead of hurrying back to Niani to deal with the Songhai uprising, he would confront it personally while demonstrating to his enemies exactly what they were challenging. The caravan that approached the city of Gao in 1325 was even more impressive than the one that had left Mali the previous year. Word had spread of Musa's reception in Cairo and Mecca, of the respect he had commanded from the most powerful rulers in the Islamic world. The soldiers, scholars, and servants who accompanied him represented connections to centers of learning and power that most African rulers could only dream of accessing. Picture yourself as one of the Songhai leaders watching this approaching force. You had expected to face a weakened Mali, an empire whose ruler had abandoned his responsibilities for religious adventure. Instead, you found yourself confronting a power that had apparently gained strength from its international exposure, backed by alliances and resources that stretched across 3 continents. The siege of Gao became a demonstration of military precision that showcased Mali's evolution under Musa's leadership. This wasn't the brutal conquest typical of medieval warfare, but a calculated display of overwhelming force designed to achieve political objectives with minimal destruction. The city surrendered without a prolonged battle, its leaders recognizing that resistance would be both futile and potentially catastrophic for their people. Musa's treatment of the conquered Songhai revealed the sophisticated approach to imperial governance that had allowed Mali to grow so large while remaining stable. Rather than destroying Gao or massacring its population, he incorporated the city into his empire as a semi-autonomous region. Local leaders retained authority over internal affairs, while acknowledging Mali's supremacy in military and foreign policy matters. It was federalism in action, centuries before European political theorists would develop formal concepts of federal governance. But the true transformation of Gao began with construction projects that announced Mali's new relationship with the wider world. As-Sahili immediately began designing a mosque that would rival the great religious buildings of Cairo and Damascus, using architectural techniques that had never been seen in this part of Africa. The structure that emerged over the following months wasn't just a place of worship. It was a statement that Mali now belonged to the same cultural and intellectual sphere as the greatest Islamic empires. The mosque's design represented a revolutionary fusion of influences that would come to define what historians now call the Sudano-Sahelian architectural style. As-Sahili incorporated building techniques from North Africa and the Middle East, but adapted them to local materials and climate conditions. The result was structures that looked unmistakably African, while demonstrating clear connections to broader Islamic architectural traditions. More importantly, these buildings served as training centers where local craftsmen learned new techniques that they would carry to construction projects throughout the empire. Within a generation, the architectural innovations introduced by Musa's foreign advisors had spread across Mali's territories, creating a visual unity that reinforced political cohesion while showcasing the empire's cultural sophistication. The educational institutions that Musa established in Gao and other newly conquered territories represented an even more profound transformation. These weren't just schools in the modern sense, but comprehensive centers of learning that attracted students from across Africa and beyond. Young men traveled hundreds of miles to study mathematics, astronomy, law, and theology under teachers whose reputations extended throughout the Islamic world. What made these institutions revolutionary wasn't just their academic quality, but their role in creating a shared intellectual culture that transcended ethnic and regional boundaries. Students from different parts of Mali's diverse empire learned together, formed friendships, and absorbed common values that would serve them when they returned to their home regions as administrators, judges, and religious leaders. The economic implications of this educational expansion were staggering. Mali was essentially investing its gold wealth in human capital, creating a generation of educated administrators who could manage increasingly complex trade networks, diplomatic relationships, and internal governance challenges. It was a strategy that would pay dividends for decades to come, as these graduates took their skills back to communities throughout the empire. From Gao, Musa's attention turned to Timbuktu, a city whose name would become synonymous with the golden age of African civilization. Located at the crucial intersection of the Niger River and trans-Saharan trade routes, Timbuktu had long been an important commercial center. Under Musa's vision, it would become something unprecedented, an African city that could compete with Cairo, Baghdad, and Cordoba as a center of Islamic learning and culture. The transformation of Timbuktu began with another architectural masterpiece by As-Sahili. The Jingareba Mosque, with its distinctive towers and massive prayer hall, became the centerpiece of an urban development project that would reshape the entire city. But the mosque was just the beginning. Musa commissioned the construction of what would become the University of Sankore, an institution that would eventually house the largest collection of books and manuscripts in Africa. Imagine walking through Timbuktu in the years following Musa's return from Mecca. The streets buzzed with conversations in Arabic, Mandinka, Songhai, and a dozen other languages as merchants, scholars, and students from across the known world conducted business and exchanged ideas. Libraries contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts covering everything from Islamic theology to Greek philosophy, from mathematical treatises to epic poetry. The city's markets offered goods from across 3 continents: salt from Saharan mines, gold from secret sources in the south, ivory from Central African forests, horses from Arabian breeding centers, books from Spanish scriptoriums, spices from Indian Ocean trade networks. It was globalization in action, centuries before the term existed, orchestrated by an African empire that had learned to project power through cultural attraction as much as military might. But, perhaps most significantly, Timbuktu became a symbol of African achievement that challenged European assumptions about the continent's capabilities. The city's reputation spread throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond, forcing scholars and diplomats to acknowledge that sub-Saharan Africa contained civilizations that rivaled anything in Europe or Asia. The university that emerged from Musa's vision produced graduates who would influence African development for centuries. These weren't just religious scholars, but mathematicians, astronomers, physicians, and philosophers whose work contributed to the broader advancement of human knowledge. Some of their manuscripts would eventually find their way to European universities, though the African origins of this scholarship would often go unacknowledged. The economic engine that funded these cultural achievements remained Mali's control of gold and salt production. But Musa's innovations in trade policy maximized the empire's advantages in ways that modern economists would recognize as sophisticated market manipulation. By maintaining strict control over gold nuggets, while allowing miners to keep gold dust, he created incentives for increased production while ensuring that the empire's most valuable export remained under central authority. More subtly, Mali's merchants operated according to protocols that protected the sources of their wealth while maximizing profits from trade relationships. Foreign merchants were allowed to purchase gold and other valuable goods, but they were never permitted to visit the mines or salt works where these products originated. This created a monopoly that persisted for centuries, as outside traders had no choice but to accept Mali's terms or find alternative suppliers who simply didn't exist. The diplomatic networks that Musa had established during his pilgrimage now paid enormous dividends as Mali became a recognized player in international politics. Treaties with North African powers provided security for trade routes while opening new markets for Malian goods. Cultural exchanges brought foreign artisans and scholars to Mali, while sending African students to centers of learning throughout the Islamic world. Yet even as Mali's influence expanded across 3 continents, Musa maintained the careful balance between visibility and secrecy that had always protected his empire. Foreign visitors saw evidence of vast wealth and sophisticated culture, but they remained ignorant of the internal workings that made it all possible. The locations of gold mines stayed secret. Military capabilities were demonstrated, but never fully revealed. Administrative systems remained opaque to outside observers who couldn't penetrate the layers of protocol and tradition that protected Mali's most sensitive information. This strategy of controlled revelation would prove crucial, as Mali's growing prominence attracted the attention of powers that might have viewed a weaker empire as an attractive target for conquest. By demonstrating strength while maintaining mystery, Musa created a reputation that deterred potential enemies while attracting profitable trading partners. As the 1320s drew to a close, Musa could look back on achievements that had transformed not just his own empire, but the entire political and cultural landscape of medieval Africa. Mali had emerged from centuries of deliberate obscurity to become a recognized superpower whose influence extended from the Atlantic Ocean to the Arabian Peninsula. The empire's cities rivaled the great centers of Islamic civilization. Its universities attracted students from across the known world, and its wealth had become legendary from London to Beijing. But empires, like the men who build them, are mortal. And as Musa entered the final decade of his reign, challenges were emerging that would test whether the foundations he had laid were strong enough to survive the inevitable transition to new leadership. The weight of immortality pressed down on Musa's shoulders, like the golden crown he wore during state ceremonies. By 1330, he had ruled Mali for nearly 2 decades, transforming a regional power into a global phenomenon that commanded respect from Cairo to Cordoba. Yet with each passing year, the question that haunts all great rulers grew more urgent. What happens when the architect of an empire can no longer hold the blueprints? Picture yourself in Musa's position, walking through the halls of your palace in Niani, as the evening call to prayer echoes across the city. The walls around you display maps showing territories that stretch further than most medieval rulers could even imagine. Gold from your mine's finances, construction projects in a dozen cities. Your universities host scholars whose reputations span 3 continents. Your army stands ready to defend borders that encompass more land than the Roman Empire at its height. But empires aren't built on maps or gold or even military might. They survive on the invisible threads of loyalty, tradition, and competence that bind thousands of administrators, governors, and local leaders to a common purpose. And those threads, Musa was beginning to realize, might not survive the transition to new leadership. The signs of strain were subtle at first, the kind of problems that only someone with Musa's experience could recognize. Provincial governors who had once responded to royal summons within days now took weeks to arrive in the capital, always with elaborate excuses about local difficulties that required their immediate attention. Tax collections from distant territories arrived late, with amounts that seemed suspiciously reduced from previous years. Military commanders requested additional resources for campaigns against threats that seemed to multiply faster than they could be defeated. Most troubling of all were the reports from his intelligence network, a sophisticated system of merchants, scholars, and diplomats who kept Musa informed about developments throughout his empire and beyond. Foreign powers were beginning to probe Mali's borders, testing response times and defensive capabilities. Neighboring kingdoms that had remained peaceful for decades were suddenly upgrading their military forces and forming new alliances. The Moroccan rulers, in particular, seemed increasingly interested in the trade routes that provided Mali with much of its wealth. Musa understood the dynamics at work better than anyone. His spectacular pilgrimage had announced Mali's existence to the world, but it had also revealed the empire's wealth to potential enemies who had previously been unaware of what prizes awaited them in West Africa. The very success that had elevated Mali to international prominence now made it a target for conquest attempts that were inevitable as his reign continued. The irony wasn't lost on him. For centuries, Mali's rulers had maintained power through careful anonymity, allowing their empire to grow wealthy and strong while remaining invisible to foreign threats. His decision to abandon that strategy had been necessary for establishing Mali's place in the broader Islamic world, but it had also initiated a countdown that would eventually force his successors to defend what he had chosen to reveal. The succession question dominated his private thoughts with increasing urgency. His son Maghan had shown promise during his regency, but ruling an empire during his father's absence was vastly different from commanding it permanently in his own right. The young man lacked the international connections that Musa had cultivated, the military experience that came from decades of campaign management, and perhaps most critically, the reputation for wisdom and generosity that had earned Musa the loyalty of thousands of subordinates. Mali's complex federal structure made the succession challenge even more daunting. Unlike European kingdoms where royal authority flowed downward through clearly defined hierarchies, Mali's empire functioned more like a confederation of semi-autonomous regions held together by personal relationships, commercial agreements, and shared cultural values. Provincial governors weren't just administrators. They were local rulers whose cooperation depended on their respect for the Mansa's leadership and their confidence in his ability to protect their interests. This system had worked brilliantly under Musa's guidance, allowing the empire to expand rapidly while maintaining internal stability. But it also meant that each new ruler had to essentially renegotiate the terms of imperial unity, proving to dozens of powerful regional leaders that continued loyalty served their interests better than independence or alliance with rival powers. The challenge was compounded by Mali's ethnic and religious diversity. The empire encompassed dozens of different peoples, speaking various languages and maintaining distinct cultural traditions that had developed over centuries. Islam provided a unifying framework for much of the population, but significant communities still practiced traditional religions, or syncretic belief systems that blended Islamic and local elements in ways that varied dramatically from region to region. Musa had managed this diversity through a combination of tolerance, patronage, and carefully calibrated displays of power that demonstrated the benefits of imperial unity while respecting local autonomy. His successor would need to master the same delicate balance, but without the advantage of decades spent building personal relationships with key leaders throughout the empire. The economic foundations of Mali's power presented another set of succession challenges that kept Musa awake during the long nights when sleep eluded him. The empire's wealth depended on maintaining control over trade routes that stretched across thousands of miles of difficult terrain, protecting merchant caravans from bandits and rival kingdoms, while ensuring that taxes and tribute flowed steadily back to the imperial treasury. This commercial network had taken generations to establish and required constant maintenance through diplomatic negotiations, military interventions, and infrastructure investments that demanded both significant resources and sophisticated planning capabilities. A single major disruption, a successful bandit campaign, a rebellion in a key trading center, or a shift in international trade patterns could trigger economic problems that would cascade throughout the empire. More fundamentally, Mali's control over gold production remained dependent on maintaining positive relationships with mining communities whose cooperation couldn't be taken for granted. The miners had demonstrated their power during Musa's early reign when they had successfully resisted his attempts to interfere with their traditional religious practices. Any future ruler would need to understand that the empire's wealth ultimately depended on the goodwill of people whose loyalty had to be earned rather than commanded. The international dimensions of Mali's position created additional complications that Musa's successors would have to navigate without his extensive network of diplomatic contacts. The empire's emergence as a major player in medieval geopolitics had created opportunities, but it had also generated enemies and rivals who were actively working to undermine Mali's influence. Egyptian rulers remained friendly, but their support depended on commercial relationships that could shift if Mali's trading partners found alternative sources for gold and other valuable goods. Moroccan kingdoms were increasingly aggressive in their efforts to control trans-Saharan trade routes, using both military pressure and economic incentives to lure merchants away from Mali's network. European powers, though still largely ignorant of Mali's internal structure, were beginning to express interest in establishing direct trading relationships that would bypass traditional intermediaries. Perhaps most dangerously, the Songhai people to the east had never fully accepted their incorporation into Mali's empire. Despite Musa's diplomatic success in managing their initial conquest, Songhai leaders continued to view their situation as temporary, waiting for opportunities to reassert their independence. Their strategic location along the Niger River gave them significant leverage in any conflict, as they could potentially disrupt the water transportation that was crucial to Mali's commercial operations. The military challenges facing Mali's future rulers reflected broader changes in medieval warfare that threatened to undermine the empire's traditional advantages. Mali's cavalry-based army had dominated West African battlefields for generations, but improvements in infantry tactics, siege technology, and defensive fortifications were beginning to reduce the effectiveness of mounted warriors in many situations. More troubling were reports that some neighboring kingdoms were beginning to acquire firearms from European and North African sources. These early guns were crude and unreliable compared to later weapons, but they represented a technological shift that could eventually neutralize Mali's numerical and tactical advantages if the empire failed to adapt quickly enough. The empire's size, which had been a source of strength, was becoming a potential vulnerability, as communication and transportation limitations made rapid response to distant threats increasingly difficult. What had once seemed like an unassailable strategic position was gradually revealing weaknesses that determined enemies might be able to exploit. Cultural and religious developments throughout the broader Islamic world also posed challenges that Musa's successors would need to address carefully. The rise of more orthodox Islamic movements in North Africa and the Middle East was creating pressure for stricter adherence to religious law, potentially conflicting with Mali's traditional tolerance for diverse belief systems and cultural practices. At the same time, the empire's success in establishing centers of Islamic learning had created a new generation of African scholars whose interpretations of religious law might differ from the pragmatic approaches that had characterized Mali's governance for centuries. These internal tensions between religious idealism and political necessity would require delicate management to prevent them from undermining imperial unity. The architectural and educational achievements that had become symbols of Mali's golden age also represented ongoing financial commitments that would strain future budgets. The universities required continuous funding for faculty salaries, building maintenance, and manuscript acquisition. The mosques and other public buildings needed regular upkeep to maintain their impressive appearance. The infrastructure projects that supported trade and communication demanded constant investment to remain functional. These weren't optional expenses that could be eliminated during difficult times. They were integral to Mali's identity as a center of Islamic civilization and learning. Reducing support for educational institutions would undermine the empire's reputation among Muslim scholars and intellectuals. Allowing architectural masterpieces to deteriorate would signal weakness to both domestic and foreign observers. Yet maintaining these commitments would require sustained economic prosperity that might not survive the political transitions ahead. As Musa contemplated these challenges during the early 1330s, he began implementing policies designed to strengthen Mali's foundations before his eventual succession. Regional governors received increased autonomy in exchange for more explicit commitments to imperial loyalty. Military commanders were rotated between different provinces to prevent the development of personal power bases that might challenge central authority. Educational institutions received additional funding and expanded curricula designed to train a new generation of administrators capable of managing the empire's complex needs. Most importantly, Musa began a systematic effort to document the administrative practices, diplomatic protocols, and commercial relationships that had made Mali's success possible. This wasn't just historical record-keeping, but a conscious attempt to preserve institutional knowledge that might otherwise be lost during leadership transitions. The process revealed just how much of Mali's governance had depended on personal relationships and informal understandings that existed nowhere except in Musa's memory and experience, and trade agreements that had been negotiated through face-to-face meetings, military alliances based on mutual respect between commanders, administrative procedures that had evolved through trial and error over decades. All of these would need to be systematized and transferred to new leaders who lacked the historical context that made them effective. Yet, even as Musa worked to prepare his empire for the future, events beyond his control were already setting in motion the forces that would test everything he had built. The year 1337 was approaching, and with it, a crisis that would determine whether Mali's golden age represented a permanent transformation of African power, or merely a brilliant but temporary achievement that would fade with its creator. The answer would reshape not just Mali's destiny, but the entire trajectory of African civilization for centuries to come. When death finally came for Mansa Musa around 1337, it arrived not with the drama of battle or the spectacle of palace intrigue, but with the quiet inevitability that claims even the mightiest of emperors. He was approximately 57 years old, his body worn down by decades of managing an empire that stretched across territories larger than medieval Europe. His mind still sharp but increasingly focused on spiritual matters that seemed to call him back toward the holy city of Mecca he had never forgotten. Picture the scene in the royal palace at Niani as news of the Mansa's declining health spread through chambers that had witnessed the planning of the greatest pilgrimage in history. Courtiers who had served him for decades moved through corridors lined with architectural innovations brought back from his legendary journey, their whispered conversations mixing practical concerns about succession with genuine grief for a ruler who had transformed their world beyond recognition. The empire Musa left behind bore little resemblance to the one he had inherited 25 years earlier. Where his predecessor Muhammad had ruled a wealthy but essentially regional power, Musa bequeathed to his successors an international phenomenon whose influence reached from the Atlantic shores of West Africa to the ancient centers of Islamic learning in the Middle East. The transformation was so complete that contemporary observers struggled to comprehend its scope. Consider the sheer scale of what had been accomplished during a single reign. Cities that had been modest trading posts, when Musa took power, now hosted universities, whose libraries contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Architectural styles that had never existed in West Africa before his pilgrimage now defined the visual identity of dozens of urban centers. Trade networks that had operated according to ancient patterns for centuries had been reorganized to channel unprecedented wealth through Mali's carefully controlled channels. Yet the very magnitude of these achievements created vulnerabilities that became apparent almost immediately after Musa's death. His son Maghan, who had shown competence during his father's absence in Mecca, discovered that ruling permanently was vastly different from serving as a temporary regent. The personal relationships that had held Mali's complex federal structure together couldn't simply be transferred from father to son like inherited property. Provincial governors who had competed for Musa's attention and approval now calculated whether continued loyalty to his successor served their interests better than independence or alliance with rival powers. The delicate balance between central authority and regional autonomy that Musa had maintained through decades of careful diplomacy required constant recalibration by someone who lacked his father's legendary reputation for wisdom and generosity. The international relationships that had elevated Mali to global prominence proved even more fragile. Foreign rulers who had treated Musa as an equal based on his demonstrated wealth and power were less impressed by his untested air. Diplomatic agreements that had been sealed with handshakes and personal promises required renegotiation by someone who hadn't participated in their original creation. Most critically, the economic foundations of Mali's prosperity began showing signs of strain that had been hidden during Musa's lifetime by his skillful management and the momentum of his reforms. The empire's control over gold production remained secure, but the costs of maintaining the educational institutions, architectural projects, and military forces that had become symbols of Mali's greatness were enormous. Musa's legendary generosity during his pilgrimage had been affordable because of the empire's vast accumulated wealth. But sustaining such expenditures required continued prosperity that couldn't be taken for granted. The Songhai territories in the east, never fully reconciled to their incorporation into Mali's empire, sensed opportunity in the transition and began testing the new Mansa's resolve with increasingly bold acts of defiance. What started as minor disputes over tax collection and administrative authority gradually escalated into open rebellion that threatened to unravel one of Musa's most significant territorial acquisitions. Maghan's response to these challenges revealed both his capabilities and his limitations as a ruler. He possessed his father's intelligence and diplomatic instincts, but he lacked the decades of experience that had taught Musa when to negotiate and when to fight, when to compromise and when to stand firm. More fundamentally, he hadn't had time to build the network of personal relationships that had allowed his father to manage Mali's diverse territories through influence rather than force. The young Mansa's reign lasted only 4 years, but they were crucial years that determined whether Mali's golden age represented a sustainable transformation or a temporary achievement dependent on exceptional leadership. His death around 1341 triggered a succession crisis that revealed how much the empire's stability had depended on the personal authority of its rulers rather than institutional structures that could survive leadership transitions. The crown passed to Musa's brother Suleiman, a man who had spent decades in his legendary sibling's shadow, but who brought his own considerable talents to the challenge of preserving what had been built. Suleiman understood better than anyone the impossible task he faced: maintaining an empire that had been created by one of history's most successful rulers, while lacking the resources, reputation, and international connections that had made that success possible. His reign, lasting until approximately 1359, represented Mali's last period of effective imperial governance. Suleiman managed to maintain control over most of the territories his brother had conquered, preserve the diplomatic relationships that connected Mali to the broader Islamic world, and continue the educational and architectural projects that had become symbols of the empire's cultural sophistication. But beneath these surface successes, the fundamental challenges that would eventually destroy Mali's unity were already taking root. The empire's size, which had been a source of strength under Musa's dynamic leadership, became increasingly difficult to manage as communication delays and transportation difficulties made rapid response to distant crises nearly impossible. The economic model that had funded Mali's golden age was also showing signs of strain that would prove impossible to reverse. The empire's wealth had always depended on controlling trade routes and maintaining monopolies over valuable resources, but the very success of those policies had attracted competitors who were developing alternative networks and discovering new sources of the goods that had made Mali wealthy. European exploration of African coastlines, still decades away from reaching Mali's territories directly, was already beginning to create new trading opportunities that bypassed traditional trans-Saharan routes. Moroccan kingdoms were becoming increasingly aggressive in their efforts to control northern sections of the trade networks that connected sub-Saharan Africa to Mediterranean markets. Most significantly, the military technologies that had given Mali's cavalry-based army decisive advantages over its neighbors were becoming obsolete as firearms began appearing on African battlefields. The empire's traditional enemies were acquiring weapons and tactics that could neutralize the mounted warfare that had been the foundation of Mali's military supremacy for generations. When Suleiman died in 1359, the succession dispute that followed shattered the last vestiges of imperial unity. His son Kasa ruled for less than a year before being overthrown by his cousin Jata, whose own reign was marked by the kind of political instability that made effective governance impossible. The civil wars that followed destroyed the administrative networks, diplomatic relationships, and economic systems that had taken generations to establish. The breakaway of vassal states began almost immediately, as regional rulers who had remained loyal to Mali through respect for Musa's legacy decided that continued allegiance to his squabbling successors served no useful purpose. The Jolof kingdom declared independence. Songhai territories that had been conquered during Musa's return from Mecca successfully revolted and established their own empire. One by one, the provinces that had made Mali a continental power chose their own paths forward. By 1400, less than 70 years after Musa's death, the empire that had once commanded respect from Cairo to Cordoba had fragmented into dozens of independent chiefdoms and city-states. The universities that had attracted scholars from 3 continents struggled to maintain their collections as funding disappeared. The architectural masterpieces that had announced Mali's arrival on the international stage began deteriorating as resources were diverted to more immediate military needs. The final humiliation came in 1670 when Bamana forces captured and burned Niani itself, destroying the capital city that had been the administrative heart of Musa's empire for over 3 centuries. The Keita dynasty that had produced Mali's greatest rulers retreated to the small town of Kangaba, where they continued to hold ceremonial authority over territories that could be measured in miles rather than the thousands of square kilometers they had once controlled. Yet the collapse of Mali's political structure couldn't erase the transformations that Musa's reign had accomplished. The architectural innovations introduced by his foreign advisors had created building styles that continued to influence African construction for centuries. The educational institutions he had established had trained generations of scholars whose intellectual contributions spread far beyond Mali's borders. The trade networks he had developed continued operating under different political arrangements, connecting African communities to global markets in ways that survived the empire's fragmentation. Most importantly, Musa's legendary pilgrimage had permanently altered how the outside world understood Africa's place in medieval civilization. European maps that had once shown vast blank spaces where Mali actually stood now included detailed references to African kingdoms and their rulers. The Catalan Atlas of 1375, considered one of the masterpieces of medieval cartography, depicted Musa as a crowned figure holding a golden orb, with text describing him as the richest and most powerful ruler in all of Africa. This transformation of global perceptions would have profound consequences that extended far beyond Musa's own lifetime. European explorers who began reaching West African coastlines in the 15th century arrived with expectations shaped by centuries-old stories of the Golden Emperor and his fabulous wealth. The Portuguese, Spanish, and later British expeditions that would eventually reshape African history were motivated partly by desires to find the sources of gold that Musa had displayed so dramatically in Cairo and Mecca. The irony was profound and tragic. Musa's decision to abandon Mali's traditional secrecy and announce his empire's existence to the world had been intended to establish Africa's place among the great civilizations of his era. Instead, it had ultimately contributed to the continent's exploitation by foreign powers, who arrived seeking the wealth that Mali's rulers had spent centuries accumulating. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of Mansa Musa's reign lies not in the political structures that collapsed after his death, or even in the economic systems that were eventually superseded by different arrangements. His true achievement was demonstrating that African civilizations could match or exceed the cultural, intellectual, and material accomplishments of any society in the medieval world. The universities of Timbuktu and other cities continued producing scholars and preserving knowledge long after Mali's political authority had vanished. The architectural innovations that emerged from his collaboration with Islamic designers influenced building styles throughout West Africa for generations. The diplomatic precedents he established showed that African rulers could engage as equals with powers from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Modern estimates of Musa's personal wealth, often calculated at over $400 billion in contemporary terms, have made him a subject of fascination for economists and historians who struggle to comprehend the scale of medieval African prosperity. But these calculations, impressive as they are, miss the deeper significance of what he accomplished. Mansa Musa's true wealth wasn't measured in gold or territory, but in his ability to transform how an entire continent was perceived by the rest of humanity. For the first time in recorded history, Africa had produced a ruler whose achievements commanded respect and admiration from the most sophisticated societies of his era. The silent empire he inherited became, through his vision and leadership, a civilization that announced to the world that African greatness was not only possible, but inevitable. Standing today in the ruins of Niani, or walking through the ancient streets of Timbuktu, you can still sense the echoes of that extraordinary moment when one man's faith and ambition reshaped the destiny of a continent. The Golden Emperor, who walked these same paths 6 centuries ago, left behind more than buildings and books. He left proof that Africa's greatest achievements have always come not from isolation, but from engagement with the wider world on terms of equality and mutual respect. That lesson, perhaps more than any treasure buried in the Saharan sands, remains Mansa Musa's most valuable legacy for the generations who continue to walk in his footsteps.